Herod is an enigmatic figure, a tyrant, a madman, a murderer, a builder of great cities and fortresses, a wily politician, a successful king, a Jew, a half-Jew, a Gentile. He was all these, and more. So that's Hebrew historian Shea J.D. Cohen commenting on Herod the Great, who we touched briefly on last week. Herod and his sons appear in the biblical narrative. He was so infamous that Caesar Augustus famously quipped, "I would rather be Herod's pig than his son," which is a pun in the Greek. And it captures Herod's brutal reputation. I start with Herod because he represents much of the world that Jesus enters in his ministry, a mix of Greek influence, Roman rule, and the fragmented Jewish landscape. In that way, he's important, but in another sense, all the places and buildings, the grandeur that Herod creates, doesn't really find itself in the biblical story. Perhaps Jesus was thinking of Herod when he said, "You know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great ones exercise authority over them." So when Jesus comes, he doesn't fit into Herod's world. Jesus didn't build grand palaces like Herod. He didn't rule at the point of the sword like the Romans. And he wasn't afraid of the people and the crowds like the religious leaders. Instead, he taught his followers that being a servant is true greatness. Jesus of Nazareth is a stark contrast to Herod. This humble servant king would live a just and perfect life, a life of radical humility, and his mission would lead him to die on a Roman cross not far from the temple, the center of Jewish religion, at the hands of lawless men. So what an incredible, vivid contrast. Herod the Great, this paranoid king over Judea, and this humble king, Jesus. It draws out the question, what kind of king is this? Who is this figure, Jesus? And who is this teacher? And what was he really like? And here we are, think about it, 2,000 years later, joining millions of worshipers every Sunday singing to this Jesus, while Herod the Great really takes up only just a few pages in the history books. So let's just take a minute and just remind ourselves where we've come so far in this class. So the first class I spent looking at why studying Jesus matters, answering the question, okay, why do we take a class? And why are we particularly focusing some on the historical setting of Jesus? Why does that matter? And then we gave four goals. The first one is that we want to know Jesus. The second one is that we want to clear misconceptions about him. The third one is we want to follow him more faithfully. And then the last one was to awaken ourselves to the beauty of who Jesus was. And then last week, I ruined everybody's Christmas, and we recalibrated ourselves around the birth of Christ and thinking of it in a first century Jewish context and how that changes the way we see this event in the setting of his birth in Palestine around 4 BC. That's important today because once again, we are trying to, really the way I think about it is clear the debris around this life of Christ and wanting to think about it in the first century context. And we really have three facets today, three kind of areas we want to talk through, and probably primarily the first two, but three areas, and that is political, religious, and cultural setting of Jesus's day, and particularly his ministry when he comes into ministry 30 years after his birth. So let's do that, but let's pray as we get started. Will you pray with me? Lord Jesus, we do ask that you would help us see you more clearly. That's what we want, through the Spirit, so that we would then love you more deeply. not for our own glory, our own just curiosity, but for your glory, for the glory also of God the Father. We pray this in your precious name. Amen. All right, we start with the political setting. So this time, there is a time between the Old Testament and the New Testament. If you think about someone reading through the Bible for the first time and they get to Malachi and then they finish Malachi, and it's what? 2 pages, it's the cover page of the New Testament, and then Matthew. And just in those 2 flips, you've skipped 400 years of history. And this period for Christians is called the intertestamental period, or broadly speaking, it's called the Second Temple period, or Second Temple Judaism. So this time is 400 years in between these, the 2 testaments. It really sets the stage and influences much of what we're going to see this morning. And outside of the Hasmonean period, which we'll talk about in a second, this region is subjugated by these massive foreign empires. So these are called the silent years because, for a number of reasons. One, there wasn't in Judaism prophecy. There is a time where they weren't seeing prophets from God. And so it's kind of known as the silent years. And then Scripture finds the canon kind of is formalized during this period. And so where do we get the information? I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this, but what are the sources that we draw for history of this time period? Since there's nothing in the Scriptures, where do we get that? Well, there's 2 primary ones for our purposes. The first one is a guy named Josephus, which we've alluded to throughout the class. He wrote 2 books. And the book on this time period is called Jewish Antiquities, it's a 20-volume set, so it's very in-depth, considered pretty reliable. And then the second thing is the Apocrypha. And part of the Apocrypha, there's a book in the Apocrypha called First Maccabees, which tells the story of the Jewish Maccabean revolt. And so those 2 are the 2 primary sources that we use kind of for this time period when we think about what's going on in Judaism in this day. And there's 3 major political powers we're going to look at in this time period during the 400 years here. The first one is the Persians. So the Persians were in charge over Palestine in 538 to 332 BC. And this is significant because we're not going to go survey the history of these empires. You probably remember this from your history books, but we're going to draw out why is it significant for Jesus' day. And there's a number of reasons, developments that happened during the Persian period that find that you will discover as you're reading the New Testament. The most obvious example for this is the rise of synagogues. So synagogues not mentioned in the Old Testament. So you're coming to, in fact, turn there. Go to Mark chapter 1. Mark chapter 1. So you're reading through the Gospels, and you come to a synagogue, and you should, if you haven't been in church at all, think, what is that? Where did that come from? And that came from the Persian period. So look at Mark chapter 1, verse 21. And this is what it says. And they went into Capernaum, and immediately on the Sabbath, he, being Jesus, entered the synagogue and was teaching. And they were astonished at his teaching, for he taught them as one who had authority and not as the scribes. So these gave rise because there was, during the Persian period, now that marks when they go back and they rebuild the temple, but there was no temple. And so synagogues they are without that place. They are a place where Jews began to congregate for local and for worship. So they're local places of worship for prayer, scripture reading, instruction. And even after the temple was rebuilt, the non-temple Judaism did flourish. So that decentralization of authority around the temple matters. So if you think about some of the groups that we're going to talk about today, the Sadducees held sway in the temple, while the Pharisees led most of the synagogues. So a synagogue in Jesus' day, what would it look like? Well, basically, there's lots of diversity around this, but for a lot of the ones that we have from the first century, they were a rectangular room, much like this. This is a replica in Nazareth Village. Not huge, but enough for a town to gather. There are benches along the walls. You can see those benches up along the walls. And then they'd have a niche or a chest where the Torah scrolls are kept. And they're in Magdala, which is a town off of the Sea of Galilee. It's famous for, in the New Testament, not because we have any explicit mention that Jesus went there, although he probably did, because we know that he went around Galilee teaching in the synagogues. But it's known for Mary Magdalene, the home of Mary Magdalene. And it's also known because in 2009, they discovered this stone in the middle called the Magdala stone, which is a carved stone block. You see it there in the middle of the synagogue. And it's the earliest known carving of a 7-branch menorah. So there's a menorah on it, and it has a bunch of temple-like symbols on this carved thing. And it probably served as a reading stand for the scroll. So if you remember when Jesus goes in Luke 4 to pull out the scroll, he pulls out the Isaiah scroll and he reads it in their presence. He would have read it at this stone. Not this particular one, but a stone like it. A service would resemble, it's hard to tell because there's lots of connections with Christian services and how much to read back those into the early services in a synagogue, but it would have been very similar to early Christian services where there'd be a reading from the law or the prophets, and then someone might explain or translate into a different language like Aramaic. Prayers were then offered, and then someone would come, sometimes a guest, like in Jesus' time, a guest. There would be deference to a rabbi who comes in and then teaches in this synagogue. So these synagogues come during the Persian period. The second thing is the rise of oral tradition. So you have the rise of synagogues, and you have the rise of oral tradition. Go to Mark chapter 7. Mark chapter 7. Oral tradition is really an attempt, now that we have the Old Testament canon, the Tanakh, now that they have it, there are these debates that arise about interpretation about it. And that is the oral tradition. And it is oral during this time period. And all the way up until the time of Jesus, it is still oral. It's not written until around, we don't have any manuscripts of it until around 200 AD. But if you look at Mark 7, look at verse 5. Verse 5 of Mark 7. And the Pharisees and scribes asked him, "Why do your disciples not walk according to the tradition of the elders?" So there's the tradition of the elders, the oral tradition. "But eat with defiled hands." And he said to them, "Well did Isaiah prophesy, you hypocrites, as it is written, 'This people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. In vain they do worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men. You leave the commandment of God and hold to the traditions of men.'" So this body of interpretation would be especially related to a number of things in Jewish life. And you see one here, and that is the food laws, but also circumcision and the Sabbath. And those are all but circumcision, are all points at which Jesus confronts the Pharisees about setting up this oral tradition. And the problem with it is that, as you just read right there that Jesus says, is that they leave the commandment of God and hold to the tradition of men. So he confronts the oral law, not the Mosaic law. So this is interpretations of the Mosaic law. He confronts them for the fact that they twist the Mosaic law. and undermine it and overcomplicate it for the people, putting a burden on the people. So it's important to note that Jesus fulfills the law. He doesn't abolish it. Okay, so those are two things, oral tradition, synagogues. The third one is the rise of Aramaic as the common language, which is just something to note because you're maybe reading through the New Testament and suddenly it says, and Jesus said, and then, well, a famous one is on the cross where he says, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, which is Aramaic. Aramaic is the common language for the common people in Judaism at this time. It's what they would have spoken in and around the marketplace. And it gave rise, spoken widely during the Persian period. So it's kind of the everyday language. Again, we're kind of limited often to just speaking English, but this would be a way within, especially Galilee, where they would communicate with each other. And then some Old Testament books, it's broader than Galilee, but Old Testament books like portions of Ezra, sections of Daniel, and then one verse in Jeremiah that are Aramaic. Any questions about the Persian period and those three phenomenons that came up? Say again? Yes, yeah, synagogues are all over, yes. So we'll talk about it in a second about where the Jewish population is. And yeah, that's a very good point. Yeah, synagogues. So the question is, are synagogues in other places in the Persian Empire? Yes, absolutely. Yes, yep. Well, we know from, I think as a general, we know from the Old Testament that they got permission to go back and rebuild. So this is the time period where they rebuilt Jerusalem, the temple, and then the walls. So generally, I don't know. Compared to the ones that are about to follow, very positive, yeah. But I guess I'll say it now. But the Jews are in dispersion. It's diaspora. They're not primarily in the land at this point. They start heading back there through all of these various time periods. They're more and more going back to Israel, the land of Israel. All right, so that's yep, go ahead. Yes. Yeah, Aramaic was broader within the Persian. It's a phenomenon broader within the Persian Empire. Yeah, absolutely. Good question. Yeah, go ahead, Jeff. I don't know. Good question. I mean, it's a cognate of Hebrew. So for the most part, it uses the same alphabet as ancient Hebrew. But it's a Semitic language, so it's in one of those. It's Semitic families. That's a great question. I don't know the answer. I can look it up, though. Yeah, Andrew. Then we got to move on. I don't think it was that line. Well, I don't know. I can't remember. But so the question is why they confuse you as calling for Elijah. I don't remember all the facets of that. So maybe we'll have to talk about that offline, yeah. All right, thank you. Let's keep going to the Greek period. So this is the Greeks came. I have it going all the way to 167 BC. You could call it the Hellenistic era too. But what I want to clarify probably is I'm lumping together several dynasties. So there's the Ptolemaic dynasty and the Seleucid dynasty that I'm just putting into this one category. And they play a part for half of this time. So the Greek Empire really doesn't last very long. Alexander the Great comes, you know from your history books. He conquers basically all of the known world, including Israel. But he dies very young, and so it's only 12 to 13 years that empire exists, and then it splits. So there's two the Ptolemaic, and then the Seleucid that play into Israel. For half of it, it's the Ptolemaic. For the other half, it's the Seleucid Empire. And a big feature of this time is Hellenism. I just mentioned it. Hellenism is the term that describes, it comes from the Greek word to actually, the idea of to promote something Greek. And it is the promotion of Greek language, culture, and civilization. And it centers on Greek cities, which is going to be very important for down the road when the gospel spreads in Paul's day. And Hellenism represented a ideological challenge to the Jewish way of life. But to note that Hellenism varied from place to place. Justo Gonzalez, a historian, says, but there were many Jews who did not regard Hellenism as a blessing, since part of the Hellenistic ideology consisted of equating or mixing the gods of different nations. They saw it a threat to Israel's faith in the one God. In a way, the history of Palestine from the time of Alexander's conquest to the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD may be seen as the constant struggle between Hellenizing Jews and native Jews. So it's pretty significant, this Hellenism idea. One of the features of it is Koine Greek. So Greek became, at this period, so we're moving ahead from the Persian to the Greek time period, and Koine Greek becomes the common language throughout the empire, the trade language, the ways in which these different groups within this massive empire communicate with one another. So nearly everyone in Israel, even during this time, spoke some of it. Doesn't mean they were fluent, but they spoke some of it. And over time, Koine Greek becomes the lingua franca of the Roman world, the common language of the Roman world. And it is the language that we have in the New Testament, this Koine Greek. And it's a unifying cultural force. So it really drives the cultural elements of Greek ideas through this whole area, the whole Greek land. I should say the supplemental material has maps for each one of these, so if you want to grab one of those maps, you can look at it. And significant for this time period is the Septuagint, which is the Greek new translation of the Old Testament. And this was during the Ptolemaic dynasty, so the first half of this time period. Septuagint means 70, and so it comes from the legend around the way that it was written. And it is a wonderful gift. And Jesus, the reason I bring this up is because Jesus, 2/3 of the time that Jesus quotes the Old Testament, he is quoting from the Septuagint, not from the Hebrew. And so it's significant that that's what he would have read. And it's also significant for New Testament studies because it's a wonderful gift that we have for understanding Greek during this time period. All right, so that's the Greek. I'm not going to talk too much about them, but they're fascinating, and that's the Hasmoneans. So in between the Greeks and the Roman period, there's a group called the Hasmoneans that rule Israel not very well. And if you remember in our history, about Antiochus Epiphanes IV, the guy who goes to Jerusalem. He's part of the Seleucid Empire. He goes to Jerusalem and he slaughters a pig on the altar of the temple. Do you remember this guy? Well, that causes a revolt. And this family rises up and then they rule for 100 years or so. And then the Romans take over. Nothing really in history compares to the Roman Empire. We don't have any comparison, any other empire that you can say, oh, it's kind of like that. Rome is unique. And it's noteworthy that the gospel writers, particularly Luke, he frames much of Jesus' life and ministry and the early church around Roman officials and the Roman Empire. Think about names that we know from the Bible. Caesar Augustus, Tiberius, who would be the emperor while Jesus' ministry was going on. Felix, in Acts, you got Felix, Festus, King Agrippa, Herod Agrippa. And what they did is they set up a client king in Israel known as Antipater. And he ruled for about 20 years. And then his son, though there was a bit of a struggle, takes over. And he's the guy that we started with. There's the Roman Empire. He's the guy we started with, Herod the Great. Herod the Great is fascinating. He ruled Palestine for 33 years. He was adept politically. He was, but he was mad. He really was a madman. He managed to keep Rome happy. He managed to keep at least the many factions within Judaism placated, and all while introducing a ton of Hellenistic ideas. And in this, he maintained a great deal of order and prosperity, even if he was unpopular among the masses. Why do you think he was unpopular? Anybody? Yeah, taxation, heavy taxes. So he was very unpopular with the people. We don't like taxes. Herod was not a religious man, but there is a religious fervor to his desire to get Greek influence into Israel. And it was mainly political for him. The main thing you notice from Herod, though, is his massive building projects. When you study him and when you go over there, you see these extensive and dramatic building projects. Some of them are absolutely stunning. Amphitheaters, hippodromes, palaces. You have shrines, fortifications like Masada, if you have heard of that. Restored cities, fountains. In many ways, then, his crowning achievement, the temple. So this is a model in Jerusalem of the temple in Herod's day, which is massive compared to Solomon's temple. And it's a massive complex. And these stones that are the retaining wall still are huge, and no one really knows how they even moved them to get them in place. They are massive stones. And so Herod, this is his crowning achievement, the temple. And the retaining wall is still standing today, known as the Western Wall. So towards the end of his life, Herod becomes increasingly paranoid about political rivals. He executes 2 of his sons and his wife towards the end of his life because he's afraid for his throne. And then when he died, and that's again why Bethlehem makes sense, fits with his character. And then after he dies, his kingdom is left to 3 sons, which we hear about, his 3 surviving sons, Archelaus, Herod Antipas, and Philip. And they're all split up between the 3, they have 3 different kingdoms. Archelaus is cruel. He's known as being cruel, and it's just why Jesus doesn't go back to Bethlehem or Joseph. He goes up to Nazareth. Herod Antipas is the Herod that Jesus interacts a few times in the New Testament. He built Sepphoris, which is the city we mentioned last week, and then the capital city kind of Galilee called Tiberias. Neither city plays a significant role, interestingly, in Jesus' life and ministry. There's not even mention that he goes there. But Herod Antipas is the one that shows up in Mark 6, Luke 13, Luke 23. And then in the south, so Archelaus is deposed in 86. So in the south, we have procurators, Roman governors that take over, and they kind of cycle through them until they come to a man, the most famous of which in scriptures is Pontius Pilate. Pilate found a way to alienate basically every Jewish group, there are 3 key incidences in his governorship that Josephus mentions. He's more weak than cruel. And you see that kind of in his story with Jesus. And we'll talk more of him. Now, another thing that correct us a little bit is the high priest. So if you're reading the Old Testament, you think the high priests are like the religious leaders of the Jewish people. But by the time you get to the New Testament, that does not seem to be at all what they are. And that you'd be absolutely right. By the time of Jesus' day, Rome treated this as a political office. So Rome is the one who decides who is the high priest. appointing and removing priests at will. And that's one of the reasons you see Annas and Caiaphas, both of them kind of acting as high priest. It's because that's the dad or the father-in-law and the son-in-law. And the father-in-law had been deposed by Rome, but he's still acting somewhat in that role. And the son-in-law is the one recognized by Rome to have any real authority. So the high priests were people that Rome used to exercise control. They were powerful, it's very family, and they were rich. They were more about ruling, overseeing the temple, keeping the feasts, keeping calm during the feasts, and significantly for our purposes, overseeing trials. They were not really so much concerned with shepherding people spiritually, but they were really political power players in Rome. So one scholar says this: it is no accident that once the high priest arrives on the scene, Jesus died shortly after. So when we think about this, say, why study this? Well, look at what Luke says up on the screen, Luke 3. In the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, when Pontius Pilate was governor of Judea, Herod tetrarch of Galilee, his brother Philip tetrarch of Iturea and Trachonius, and Lysanias tetrarch of Abilene, during the high priesthood of Annas and Caiaphas, the word of God came to John, son of Zechariah, in the wilderness. So that's John the Baptist's ministry starting there. But look how the framing of this is all with these Roman leaders. All right, Jesus in Rome. Was Jesus an anti-Roman zealot or political revolutionary? Yes or no? No, he was not. Rather, he redefined the kingdom as a kingdom not of this world. Rome then, in my judgment, is merely incidental. It's a tool, an operating as a means by God's providence to bring the cross. Rather than occupying Jesus's really his mind, his primary intentions or his actions. In the end, was it theologically subversive? Was Jesus's ideas, did it subvert the Roman Empire? Absolutely. The oppression in the Roman Empire, it would have subverted it. But that was not Jesus's mentality going in. And there is in scholarship a ton of emphasis on how Jesus was really going up against Rome because they need to explain why Rome killed him outside of theological reasons. All right, so that is the political setting. Any questions about the political setting briefly? All right, let's go to the religious setting. So the Second Temple period has several characteristics. I'm just going to note two. One is sectarian or factions. It had become very diverse, and different groups splintering around different interpretations of the text. So it was far from unified during this period. The second thing I mentioned briefly was the diaspora, that is Jews in dispersion. So there are roughly, their numbers vary, of course, on these things, but 5 million Jews throughout the world. Only about 1/10 of those are in Israel. So they're primarily spread out throughout the world. And yes, synagogues would go with that. Now, by the time of Jesus, we don't know for sure, but it probably is that the majority of Galilee was Jewish. So by the time of Jesus. So living under Roman rule, Gentile rule for this long, the ideas of Hellenism, there are two basic responses that the Jewish people, two spectrums that the Jewish people, the Jewish leaders, religious leaders take. On one side, there is separatism. That is, they chose to kind of cloister off to some degrees more than others, cloister off and limited resistance. The other side was assimilation. So then there are some that decide just to blend in and adapt intentionally. That it was measured, it was a deliberate response to assimilate to the ideas of the Greek world and Roman world. And these two responses are really seen clearly by two groups within the New Testament. And the first one in your blank there is the Pharisees. The Pharisees. So the Pharisees lean towards separatism. Pharisees come from a group, the Hasidim, the devout, later be called Pharisees. They're known as, that means separate ones. And it's probably, again, born out of a desire to respond to Hellenism and keep Jews Jewish. So there's some sense where there's this identity thing. There's about 6,000 influential Pharisees during this time. So again, if you think about numbers, that's less than 1% of the population, of Jewish population in Israel. They were the most learned among them were scribes, who essentially operated as priests, the Old Testament priests in the days of Jesus. And almost every village had a synagogue, which then had a Pharisee rabbi who oversaw things. And they're the most influential, it doesn't surprise you, the most influential religious force in Judaism during this time, during the time of Christ. They were held, it's hard for us because we associate Pharisees with what? Yeah, bad guys, but hypocrisy. We see that they're a bunch of hypocrites, but that's not the way that they would have been seen by the average Jew. They would have been held in high esteem due to their pursuit of holiness. Again, Jesus says it in Matthew, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and the Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. So there is a desire for them to keep the traditions, stand firm against secularizing forces of Greek ideas coming into the promised land. So we can see a little bit that they were obsessed with Jewish identity, and a lot of that comes out in various points. So the question comes for me is, why did the Pharisees oppose Jesus? Because it's important. If you don't know, there's a big debate about this, because the idea is, well, is it just because they were seeking to earn their salvation, so Jesus comes with grace to teach them grace, or is there some other things going on? I don't want to get necessarily into that debate, but I want to look and think and consider from the New Testament, why are they opposing Jesus? And I think there's a number of reasons. The first one is that they're exposed for their hypocrisy. So Jesus comes, and what is it? You hypocrites. I mean, calls straight up. You hypocrites. Which I think if you think about, if you're in front of a crowd of people, which often you were, and someone says, hey, Jason, you hypocrite, and you are really concerned about what that crowd thinks about you, you're not going to like that. So there's a couple dynamics. Number one, they were hypocrites. They cleaned up the outside, but they weren't focused on the heart. But number two, it lowered them in the eyes of the people who they cared very much about. So that's the first one. And that leads to the second one, jealousy. So it threatened their authority. There's some jealousy you see of Jesus going around with these huge crowds. And then they were also kind of a dynamic maybe we wouldn't see today, in our day, with someone who has a great following, but they were very worried about political instability, even the Jewish leaders. So it threatened some kind of, they had plans, and as you follow the story all the way to AD 70, they had plans, but they wanted to do it in a certain way. And so to suddenly upset, there's this kind of figure coming in that doesn't fit with the Sadducees or the Pharisees or Rome, and he's just disrupting the whole plan. You can see them respond to it. The fourth one is theological disputes. These are Jewish family disputes, things that they've argued about before. So these questions that they come up with, questions to Jesus to try to trick him. These are things that are conversations like in a seminary where it's like everybody's talking about these things. That's the type of idea. Ultimately, obviously, in the theological part, they reject him as the Messiah too, as well. This fits with the emphasis of, again, Jesus opening up the kingdom to Gentiles. So I guess it's more complex, I think, than those two camps of earning righteousness. I think there's part of that we know from nature. They were trying to earn their salvation, or stay into the covenant people, whatever, however you want to word it. But even there is some Jewish identity things involved too. So if you think about their emphasis really is about Hellenizations coming in, and they're trying to maintain this Jewish identity. And then there's a rabbi who comes in and says, he emphasizes heart over the rituals that they think are so important, and then he undermines the Pharisees' separatist strategy, right? Keep the Gentiles out there, Jews over here. And by opening up the kingdom to non-Jews, he cuts their vision for Jewish identity and national renewal at the root. I mean, it really does hit them right at a nerve. And so that's a reason why they oppose him so strongly. And then another one for us theologically, Jesus places himself at the center of the Bible, fulfilling the law and the prophets. He is the one that the law and the prophets point to. And that's way too much for them to stomach. I mean, the law was something they were trying so carefully to keep that they put these oral traditions, these fences around it. And now Jesus says, I fulfill it. And the whole Bible points to me as the Messiah. I'm the culmination of this. And so they seek then to kill him. Jesus responds to the Pharisees by exposing their hypocrisy, confronting their legalism, their self-righteousness. In a beautiful way, he points to their blindness. I mean, in doing so and pointing to their blindness, their blind guides, he opens their eyes and our eyes too to where perhaps we show up as the Pharisees. And again, Jesus cared about the heart over externals, which is always a challenge for any person in any era, in any time period, that God cares most about our hearts. Okay, so that's the Pharisees. Any questions about the Pharisees? Yeah, absolutely, yes. So the question is it have to do with the temple? And because Jesus is going to have some monumental things he's going to do, cleansing the temple, the Sadducees. And yes, he is around. These crowds are following him as a rabbi. Certainly, so there is tension with both groups, yep. He's going to confront both, as we'll see in just a second. All right, that's a clue. The next one is the Sadducees. So they represent assimilation. They're not popular with the people. They controlled the temple. They're the most influential group within the Great Sanhedrin, which is a 71 member Supreme Court kind of idea within Jerusalem. And the Sadducees are essentially, lack for a better term, liberals. They are cultured aristocrats, smooth politicians. They're pragmatic, adopting positions that just suit them politically. And they're known for denying several things, but what's the one in the New Testament that we have in both the Gospels and Acts? Yeah, the resurrection. They're anti-supernatural. They really think that this is the end. There's really nothing beyond this time period. So the point is your rewards then, so wealth plays into this because your rewards come from pleasing God. You get all that wealth in life because there is no afterlife. So Jesus confronts them with a phrase that it's always been kind of haunting to me. To the Sadducees, he says, "You don't know the scriptures or the power of God." You don't know either when talking about the resurrection. So do we truly know the scriptures? Have we experienced the power of God? There are a bunch of other groups. You see them in your notes there. Herodians are a political sect that is faithful to Herod, hence the name. Then you have publicans or tax collectors. Publicans just as a public servant. The term comes from public servant. The IRS agents of their day, not liked very much because their salary now to be fair, their salary came from skimming off the top. And we have one of those is Jesus' disciple. And then the same with the zealots. not mentioned except for we have one who is a disciple of Jesus, and the Essenes are not mentioned in the New Testament. But they're the extreme example of the separatism. All right, we got to talk about messianic expectations. So this pervades first century Judaism. There's this sense in which the people are looking for the Messiah very actively. And the example I have to think about is if you think about John the Baptist in Luke 3:15, he says, as the people were in expectation. So here's John the Baptist, and they're thinking what? John the Baptist is the Messiah. Yeah, they're thinking he's Messiah. So it says, all were questioning in their hearts concerning John whether he might be the Christ. So they are earnestly looking to him. So this expectation didn't die from the Old Testament. Jews saw Yahweh as the king of the universe, and he one day would set up the son of David to rule in Jerusalem over all nations. So they saw this as happening, like in Acts 1, when would God restore the kingdom of Israel? So they're looking for it in these days. Very acute to it. And the fact is, this time period leading up to Herod, William Barclay, this is a quote from him. I don't think I have this in the slides. Nope. It is the simple historical fact that in the 30 years from 67 to 37 BC, before the emergence of Herod the Great, no fewer than 150,000 men perished in Palestine in revolutionary uprisings. And you have all these, if you look in the literature, you have all these Messiah-like figures that are coming up. So it is a movement of who is the Messiah and when will he come? And he says, there is no more explosive and inflammable country in the world than Palestine. And we see it with Caiaphas. What does Caiaphas say? He says, it is better for you that one man should die for the people and not the whole nation should perish. So he sees Jesus as another one of these figures that's going to bring about some kind of great political revolutionary revolt, and Rome's going to come and squash it. So the Second Temple period, Judaism is characterized by sectarianism. It's characterized by Jews being in the diaspora. Two responses: separatism, assimilation, and then this messianic expectation, which fuels a lot of the various moving pieces of the people, of the religious leaders, of the Roman officials, and it's going to set the stage for Jesus' ministry. Jesus, though, is not what anyone expected. You see that? He's not. Think of someone where they thought, oh, that's what, Jesus is what they expected. And I think for us, it's a great reminder. Oftentimes, if someone hears about Christ for the first time, starts coming to church, they begin having this expectation of Jesus, that he would eliminate all suffering in their life. He would come in this life, he'd give prosperity, rid all the injustices for them in this moment, perform miracles for them almost on demand, simply uplift their self-esteem, make them feel like a better person, or just keep their relationship private. It won't actually impact their real life. But when you encounter the real Jesus, just like those in the first century, he does not meet your expectations. He exceeds them, but it's good to remember he does not meet your expectations in the way, perhaps, that you bring to him, but he overwhelmingly answers them above and beyond. So that is the religious setting. Now we got to talk about the cultural setting briefly. I'm not going to get into all these, but the feasts and festivals, the supplemental material is about the various feasts and festivals. A lot of the gospel writers, there's these events that happen at various feasts. If you want to learn a little bit about that, there's in the supplemental. A couple things that are different than our culture. One, emphasis on purity and uncleanness. So we just don't have that idea. And the element I want to highlight with that is that it's very much not merely about morality as much as it is about this social dynamic, this stigma or exclusion that we just in some ways don't feel when we're reading through the New Testament narrative. that when they're unclean, there is this sense of social outcast. So think about the woman who had a discharge of blood for 12 years. One of the significant things about that is 12 years she's been isolated. So you think she can live with it. If you live with a chronic disease for 12 years, in some sense, you're living with it. But the isolation, the real focus of that is she's unclean. And so she's completely isolated or has to go through cleansing and various things. The other thing that comes up are the ritual baths, which were mikvahs. You see this all around during this time period where there is this purity, and they go down into the water and then they come out clean. And Jesus is going to talk about some of these purity things. And he says it's not what's outside the body that defiles you, but what's in the heart. And then the last thing that I want to mention is honor and shame. So we don't have that. Those are different. It's different in their day as it is in ours. And the example I always think of is John the Baptist, is Herod and John the Baptist. So the request, I think if we got the request, like cut off this guy's head as the option, we would be like, no, okay, give me another request. I'm not going to cut off this guy's head. But he does it in front of people. So there is a sense, the text says, in order not to be, to stay, not have a shame in front of this crowd, he decided to go ahead and cut off John the Baptist's head. So honor and shame is totally different in this time period than it is in our day. Those are just a few things. All right, to close. Providential preparation for Christ. 3 P's, a lot of P's in there. Providential preparation. And then we got 3 P's. So you think about this. As Jesus comes into his earthly ministry, there are 3 things that the Roman Empire particularly, and Greek influence gives us. The first one is peace. Peace. If you ever heard of the Pax Romana, there is unity that allows Jesus and then the church to spread. The second thing is path. The Greek language, as we talked about, becomes the medium of communication for much of the world. And so there is really this, and not only that, but you can travel. Travel becomes much more accessible during this time period and comparatively safe and easy than it was before. So Rome brings stability. And then the last one is people. We've mentioned it in this class a couple times now. The diaspora spread all over the Roman Empire and really becomes a place for early missionaries of Christianity, the starting point for sharing the gospel. It's amazing to see how God orchestrated all these events to bring Christ at the right time, to send his son. Galatians 4:4, and when the fullness of time had come, God sent forth his son, born of a woman, born under the law. The fullness of time. You can see in all of the things we mentioned, it's the perfect time. And it's a good reminder for us too, I think, to close, to think about this. Who knows? Who knows what God is doing in and amongst the political and the cultural and the religious situations of our day? If this is what he did in their day, there is much that he could be using for his glory today. Thank you very much. You're dismissed.